printing market is expected to grow from approximately $5 billion currently to approximately $17 billion in 2020, according to the consultants A.T. Kearney. To achieve this growth, a supportive regulatory and political environment is going to be very, very fundamental. And research conducted earlier this year by the 3D Printing Association identified the regulatory environment as a key focus for all of its members. And the focus of today's discussion is to build on this research and to explore the following sort of questions in terms of what the industry can best do to deal with regulation and the challenges ahead. We want to explore, first of all, on today's panel, how supportive the current regulatory environment is, what the current state of play is in terms of the challenges that we're facing internationally and specifically, or more importantly, in Europe, where we are today. What is the industry doing to deal with these threats, and what should it be doing if it isn't doing enough? And finally, what steps should EU member states and the European institutions be thinking about taking to foster a more supportive regulatory and policy environment? Now, as you probably heard from my questions, we're primarily going to be focusing on the European angle today, but we're not limited to this, so if any of you have any interventions or experiences of what's going on in foreign territories, please feel free to chip in. And before we start, I'll just quickly briefly say something about who I am and give the panelists a chance to introduce themselves. My name's Shomik Panda, and I'm the Managing Director of Inline Policy, which is a political and regulatory consultancy based in London and Brussels. And we support innovative sectors deal with regulatory challenges. And so we're really happy that Ian's asked us today to help him and his sector understand how best to put the right frameworks together in Europe. I'm delighted to be joined by three excellent panelists today, Chris, Todd, and Adrian, and I'm now going to ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves and also who they're representing. So, Chris, over to you first.
We need to stay here. Hello, my name is Chris Kramptiz, and I work for Underwriters Laboratories. We're a global safety and quality organization. We do testing, inspection, and certification across many industries. I lead the digital manufacturing group for UL, and my role is the director of innovation and strategy. So I look at the regulations, but also the market needs and the type of testing, inspection, and certification support that's needed to ensure the safe production of parts, quality parts as well, but also the safety of the parts themselves.
I'm Todd Grimm. I'm a consultant in the 3D printing space, been in the industry since 1990. And I think, well, I don't know who everyone is and what companies you're with, but I might represent you very well because my position is of ignorance with regards to regulatory and legislative concerns, hoping that someone protects me and that I don't get blindsided by something. So I may bring more of a practical answer to the questions that are posed rather than insightful on this is exactly what we need to do.
My name's Adrian Sim. I'm a partner at Bristows, which is a law firm in the City of London. Our firm specialises in sort of technology-related deals and transactions, and I'm a specialist in sort of intellectual property and IT law. So we work quite a lot with organisations, both startups and established companies that are operating in the market, both when they're trying to do business, but also if there are challenges, lawsuits against them.
Thanks very much. So the format of the event today is going to be a straight sort of panel discussion at the beginning. I'll be asking the panelists various questions, first on the current regulatory challenges, and then in the second half we'll be looking ahead to what the future challenges are and what the industry should be doing. And then we'll open up to the floor so that all of you will have a chance to question the panelists on anything that they've said or anything else that you want to ask them. So, to kick off the first session on current regulatory challenges, Chris, I wanted to first ask you how supportive you think the current regulatory and policy environment is for the 3D printing industry in Europe, and if you have any insight on how Europe compares favorably or not favorably against the US or any other international jurisdictions.
Yes, I think one thing that we're facing in our industry, in the additive manufacturing industry, is the lack of regulations, and I think that's true in the EU and also in the US as well. Where they're not, the regulations in place are specific to the products, and we have the safety standards associated with those products. There are very few to no regulations actually in both regions that are focusing on additive manufacturing and trying to move it in one direction or the other. There certainly has been a lot of discussion in both regions, in the EU and the US, on the different types of regulations that are needed, but none of the bodies have really taken any steps forward to actually implement any regulations. Both in the EU and in the US, many of the regulatory bodies have been approaching the third-party organizations like us to provide them with some guidance on what regulations they should focus on, or what areas to focus on regulations. And I think right now that that's one area where we're lacking regulations at this point. I think we just don't have a regulatory landscape like we do for some other industries or some other applications.
Thanks. Adrian, just to ask you, what do you think, because I know as a lawyer you'll be looking at this probably all day, what do you think the biggest regulatory and policy challenges are currently facing the sector in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think one of the biggest issues with the additive manufacturing industry is that there aren't specific regulations in Europe at the moment. And it does really depend on what you're producing and how you're producing it. So one of the biggest challenges is you need to be across such a broad range of regulations. So if you're operating in the medical devices space, you need to look at how the medical devices regs are going to apply to you. And that one's quite an interesting one in particular, because that's currently being looked at again, and they might revise it to specifically look at the supply chain. So if you're supplying into a final medical device, they're going to be looking at how they can assure that each component of the medical device has actually been constructed in a proper way and meets all the relevant safety standards. But then you've got all these other regulations that aren't directly related to 3D printing but will affect it, whether it's intellectual property rights, consumer issues, and even random things like tax, because obviously you're going to have a lot of consumer to consumer products now rather than the traditional sort of business to consumer business model. So I think sort of the diverse landscape from the regulatory perspective is one of the biggest challenges, because there's no harmonization, there's no specific one law that you can look at that is going to affect all players in the 3D printing space. So that's one of the main things. I mean, from my perspective, I focus on intellectual property, and intellectual property rights are a real challenge for everyone in the industry. One, again, across Europe, there's not great harmonization, and even in the UK, you can create a 3D product, an object, which will have copyright, patent, trademark, design rights issues, but they'll all be dealt with in a different way. So, reproducing a particular object may be permissible from a copyright perspective, but you might get stung for patent infringement for doing exactly the same thing. And it's very difficult to then, go to market with certain products without knowing exactly how the intellectual property laws are going to affect it. So, that's just another example of some other regulations which are going to be really challenging for the industry. And there's a lot of discussion at the moment throughout the European community about harmonization. There's the new digital single market strategy that is looking at, updating copyright and intellectual property laws. But it is quite a challenge, because at the moment, you've got X number of member states all with different implementations of a particular law. So if you're marketing or selling in different jurisdictions, you have to have an awareness of each of those issues. And I guess one of the other things that really hasn't been addressed at that really high sort of policy level yet is the liability issues. Obviously, there are a lot of people that are involved in the final product that's produced from additive manufacturing. The person that creates the design document or design file, the printer component, or the person that creates the printer, the person actually doing the printing. So there are a lot of people in that chain. And if something were to go wrong, so if you start doing 3D printing, which people are, in safety critical areas, whether it's aerospace, medical devices or otherwise, and there's a problem, there is a real question about who's going to be responsible for that. Like, who's going to bear the cost of, someone dying in a car crash if it's one of the 3D printed components that may actually contribute to that accident. So, I mean, the short answer is there's a lot of, the challenges are really quite vast at the moment. And as we were saying before, there hasn't been a unified approach to this. There is a lot of discussion at the moment. There's not a unified approach as to how this is going to be tackled. And I think it's good to be having these discussions now, because you can start getting ahead of the regulations and start shaping the debate to try to take it in the direction that the industry needs.
Thanks, Adrian. I mean, just one thing to follow up on that. Do you think there's an appetite from discussions you've had with industry participants for the industry to have one harmonized regulation across Europe, which is across a whole list of silos applicable to 3D printing, or would you prefer, the current status quo to develop in a siloed sort of approach? Do you have any sense on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, from a lawyer's perspective, I think we'd rather it all be siloed so that, you can give more advice. But I think from the industry perspective, having one harmonized regulation that deals with everything would be fantastic. But I don't think that's realistic, because they're not going to make exceptions to the medical devices regulations, the Consumer Rights Act, to deal strictly with 3D printing components. They're going to say, well, if you're operating in this space, there are existing laws that you need to comply with, and they're not going to make exceptions, I don't think, for 3D printing. But what the industry can do, though, is start looking at the specific regulations that do govern how you run your business, and start lobbying governments, even at the very highest level, like at the European Commission level, to say, well, look, when you guys are revising these regulations or these laws, you need to bear in mind the impact it's going to have on our industry. And that's happening. Like, the European Commission is very interested in this area. Like, even last year, there was a roundtable discussion about what are going to be the regulatory impacts for 3D printing. And it was the start of the discussion, but it's a good place to start, because at that really top level, there is a lot of interest in this. And that will hopefully filter down, to all the member states, and then all, the local implementations of those laws.
Todd, just to come to you, we'll change the nature of the question a little bit. From your experience, how advanced do you think policymakers and regulators in Europe are in terms of their thinking with regards to 3D printing? Do you think they have a good understanding of the sector?
Can I be honest?
Yeah,
I can't comment on the EU, this region of the world. I don't know the dynamics. I don't know it from the United States either, but I think it would be a very safe bet that there's a high level of awareness, but an extremely low level of understanding, appreciation, and experience. So I think our biggest threat is one of allowing things to just move on without getting ahead of it and informing and educating, or at least providing an opportunity where people know where to go to get the answer. So there's not a rollover effect, some silly regulatory move, some silly law. It's not even bad against legislators. If you hear me speak and write, there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of lack of education, even in the user community, on the technology. So how can we expect more from someone who their day job is not dealing with this technology? It's very broad, very expansive. So if we were to take actions as the 3D Printing Association or as the industry in a whole, I think the key thing we could do is get ahead of it, be a resource for data. That's a key thing. Data, experience, and understanding, so they can make semi-educated policy decisions.
Okay. And just, you mentioned the industry just generally. In terms of what the industry has done so far, can you shed any light in terms of what industry has done in terms of this high-level engagement up to this date? Should the industry be doing more, or is the industry doing enough?
Don't take offense, Chris. So there's always isolated cases and exceptions, but in general, I don't think we've done anything with regards to regulatory. There might be isolated instances or an individual company trying to take a stand, but as a unified voice, nothing. Is there a need? Absolutely. Is it likely or possible? We're going to need a hub to make that happen. There's going to have to motivating factor and an easy wagon to hitch your horse to, instead of everyone trying to do it on their own. So if the 3D Printing Association or another association can provide this hub where it's very easy to latch on and leverage that, and now you got a unified voice, that'd be very beneficial. But no action, no activity right now. But at the same, let me say, it's not negative against our industry either, because I was just at a trade association for plastics, International Association of Plastics Distributors. The organization was founded in the 50s, and it was just 2 years ago that they created an arm to do lobbying and regulatory and legislative work, and they're still trying to find their way. So this is plastics. So for us not to have that, by no means is a negative. We're still a new, growing industry. So if we were to do it, I think it'd be unique and different in trying to get ahead of the curve.
Let's just move ahead now and try and shift the discussion from what the current state of play is to what the challenges might be in the future. And Adrian, I wanted to ask you what, you've already touched on some of the major challenges facing the industry at this point, but what regulatory and policy challenges do you think might develop in the future that we're not yet currently aware of? If that's a fair question, that you might have already addressed that the first time around. And do you think the sector is well prepared to deal with these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite difficult to say what's going to happen in the future and how that's going to impact the associations and the various organisations that operate within it. But I mean, what I would say is the thing that can happen now that can help safeguard against that is education. So, as you said, there's a lot of awareness of 3D printing, additive manufacturing, and what that, but maybe not a great understanding of what that means. And I think if you can get ahead of the game in terms of awareness, both in the public generally, and then obviously with the actual people that are going to be setting the regulations, that's going to have a massive impact on the way that they shape the regulations when they eventually come to bear and how they apply to this industry. Because the better understanding people have about it, the more they'll be able to understand, well, if we do change a regulation in a particular way, that's going to have a really significant impact on on everyone who's here at this particular trade show and everyone that operates in the industry. And I think that it's possible, and it's possible to work with other organisations, like for example, like Tech UK, that's quite active throughout the United Kingdom in terms of lobbying government, and they represent a lot of technology-related companies, which pretty much everyone here would fall within the scope of that remit. And working with organisations like that who do have the resources and are already lobbying government quite actively to get 3D printing on the agenda at that level is going to be great. And then in the UK, there's BIS who are always engaging with industry, and it just takes a bit of a groundswell to get ahead of that curve and to start educating the wider community, and then through these types of discussions, the policymakers, and influencing it before they become regulations. Because once they start talking about draft regulations that are going to impact your industry, it's pretty much too late then to shift the discussion.
Todd, what steps do you think could be taken by European member states and EU institutions to foster a more supportive regulatory environment for the sector?
I want to build off of Adrian's comment. To go this alone as our industry, I don't think is wise. We touch on so many other traditional processes, other technologies. I think it'd be possibly wise to join forces, and it could be one of, we're in plastics and we're in metals, obviously, right now. So look to the plastics industry and see if there's anything we can bring to the table in an additive manufacturing context that helps them to do regulatory policy work and also protect us. Do the same things with metals. So look to partner rather than to try to do this on our own. And to take, not answering your question, but going a different way, one thing I think we can also do, this getting ahead of the curve thing, I hate to bring this up because I hated the topic 2 years ago, but the 3D printed gun story, that's the kind of thing that I think if we could be positioned to have a team that rolls out with a response statement, get ahead of it and educate, so a mobilization force that if we do sniff something out and we see this groundswell of uproar, because I was getting phone calls on how do we protect from people being able to 3D print guns and all that. It's like, well, with our technology, it's kind of free. You can't do that. But if we had a team to roll out and go get facts and data and approach it, if you made legislators aware that anyone with some skills with a bandsaw and a drill press could make a basic firing weapon, so all we're doing is providing a digital tool, maybe that would change the conversation instead of all be directing at 3D printing. So to get ahead of it by having a force that mobilizes as soon as we sniff out an important aspect that could possibly blow back upon us.
And do you think there's a role also for the 3D Printing Association here in terms of what information it gives to members? Anything there that can be done that the association can do from an information perspective that will be useful?
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. So if segments of our industry were facing regulatory items, to be a resource to provide not only information but even the tools to go out and get the facts that need to be acquired to develop the report would be very beneficial. Give anybody information to the system, it's always going to be beneficial. So a possible role of the 3D Printing Association could be that central resource that supports not only its individual members but the segments of the additive manufacturing industry with the tools, the manpower, the data. It could be very beneficial.
So, thanks, Todd. Adrian mentioned a bit earlier that one of the things that's quite critical is for the industry to get in front of the policymakers before they start drafting these laws, because otherwise, a lot of the game is already over. In that regard, I wondered, if you were going to approach policymakers in Europe or the UK at this moment, are there any examples of best practice internationally that you think could be adopted in Europe that Europe should be seeking to emulate? Or are there any specific asks that you would want government to potentially pick up on, Chris?
Yeah, I think we mentioned some of them already up here. Some of the best practices that we've seen is to educate the regulators on the issues and the safety issues. That's something that we are particularly focused on. But educate them on those safety issues associated with 3D printing, and us, having our hands in a lot of different industries and seeing the safe practices across different industries, we're able to see what other industries have done to mitigate risk and to ensure safety of the users, and those things are transferable over to additive manufacturing. So it's educating the regulators, but also the industry on how to do that. So we've been taking an active role in doing that in the U.S. to educate the FDA on the issues, to educate OSHA on the issues regarding worker safety, but also medical devices. So we take an active role in that, and we're also taking an active role in the European Commission to educate the folks there on what are the safety issues and what's already been established that could be used for additive manufacturing, instead of creating regulations that are specific to additive manufacturing that have already been created for other industries. So I think it comes back, from my perspective, to education and ensuring the regulators are aware of the true safety issues and what has been done in other areas or other industries to address those issues, so that we can use the relevant pieces from those other industries.
Okay, I think probably just people on the floor will have a lot of questions to ask, and it's probably best at this stage to open it up to them. I'm sure they've got lots of insights. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to ask the panelists a question on anything they've said? Or
I just wonder, because there is no real regulation at this moment in time, and it's not just about the 3D printing growing, but you've got all these individual people who want to create a business with what they can now see as an easy, affordable option. Are we going to get to a stage where we don't do anything until there's a catalyst, until one day, I know you want to be proactive in how you're doing it, and one of the things to be proactive, you need funds to do it in a way that you're going to be able to implement safety standards within 3D desktop printing. We get lots of people who want to create medical or engineering devices and think that they can sit at home, and with a new type of filament that comes out, they can then create that device and then sell it, and whether sell it on eBay. Are we waiting for all of a sudden somebody say, hang on a minute, exactly, a car broke down, or somebody had a dental replacement or a face replacement or whatever? Are we waiting for that, or are we working towards being proactive?
So I'll start. We are being very proactive about it in the industrial scene, but also in the personal machine level as well, and ensuring that those personal machines that homemakers or homeowners are purchasing, that are safe to use and won't pose any electrical or fire hazards. We're also being very proactive with the materials you purchase. Many of the materials, the filaments you purchase for personal machines, are not compliant with any of the regulations. So we are working with the filament suppliers to be certified for certain certain
It's only
applications.
because there's a new filament on the market, antimicrobial, from South Korea. You know, it's safe to use in food use. Okay, let's create a whole dining set for, you know, a classroom somewhere. Are we then waiting to find out if the regulations that passed in Korea is not suitable for the UK, but we actually then find out when from somebody university who's done a test, and then all of a sudden they're waving their hands that, you know, the filament that you just been selling to these particular people based on this isn't legislative. Now, for me, that isn't proactive enough, because someone down that line is going to get caught out for that.
So what we're doing is building awareness at a consumer level of the things that you need to pay attention to ensure that you're purchasing materials that are safe. And so getting a certified material for food applications, make sure that you look for one that's certified for that application. And if it's certified for the EU, then it meets all the you know, if an organization like ours certifies that filament or that material, then it meets all the regulatory requirements for that application. We do that, we're trying to do that in the U.S. So if the manufacturer could be in Korea and trying to enter the EU market or the U.S. market, and the way we are approaching it, and we're being very proactive about it, is engaging those suppliers and urging them to do the testing on the materials to get certified by us, so that we can assure that it meets regulatory requirements and is safe to use in the different markets.
It's because there's a couple of materials that are coming to market, and one of them was the FDA approved 680 from Tolman's. For us, from desktop printing, Tolman's is quite a well-known professional manufacturer of a filament. So he has it down as FDA approved. Does that mean that when it's in the UK and we're selling it as FDA approved, is it FDA approved or not? And has it gone through every regulatory body in the US?
And that's where we have to be careful, because the FDA does not approve materials.
But
Yeah.
This is exactly it. It's that knowledge. Nobody has that knowledge at this moment in time.
Right, so we're building awareness of that, because we've seen the same thing with people have been claiming that materials are FDA approved, or they're making claims, and those claims are not true. That's why I think it's important, and our view is that in this industry, the third-party assessor is really important to ensure that the materials are safe, or the processes are safe, and are producing quality products.
If that event happens where, you know, it suddenly hits the headlines that, you know, there are materials out there being used commonly in 3D printing that aren't safe, then it's almost like the game's over and you've got this massive PR disaster. But it's true, like, I mean, if you think a layer below the regulatory framework, so you may not have your EU-wide regulations that are applying, there are certain, like, you know, the British Standards Institute, for example, can create standards so that people at least, you know, there can be some type of certification, as we were saying, that you know that this particular filament or this element or this component or material that you're using is safe for certain, you know, for certain uses, like whether it's for food, for medical devices, or otherwise. And that's one thing that can happen at an industry level, like to get the groundswell of buy-in to say, actually, we should have these standards that should apply. They may not be sort of, you know, enforceable by law, but people will get, you know, the consumers out there will get comfortable that, okay, well, I know it meets a certain level of, you know, quality. It's not going to, you know, break down or deteriorate within a period of time. It's not going to be toxic for particular uses. And that is something that the industry can really influence, because, you know, in a number of industries, you do get these industry standards which start as, you know, non-binding standards, and then the more common and more, you know, well publicized they get, so that, you know, consumers start thinking, well, actually, the law may not require it, but me as a consumer will require it. And then eventually the law catches up and goes, actually, we're going to set the law at this same standard as well. And so that is something that the industry can actually do now, before the regulations are in place, to start to try building that level of confidence, you know, from the wider market.
My question is perhaps more fundamental. I'm wondering why you would want, as an industry, why we would want as an industry to be different in any way from existing legislation, health and safety, from just high-tech subtractive manufacturing. Doesn't it behove us to move in complete sync with other initiatives? I mean, clearly not all laws are available covering all new material science, new processes and so on, but to try and go out on a limb strikes me as adventurous. Shouldn't you just be harmonic and completely integrated with developments going on in new technology and so on in conventional manufacturing?
Mark, I agree with you 100%. I think the one comment I put on your statement is that if we take action, it should be to make sure that any standards, regulatory policy, and all that does not artificially grade additive manufacturing in a way. There's an element that's not considered in a subtractive environment that may or may not apply to additive. So along the lines of one of my themes when I talk with manufacturers about looking at additive manufacturing is stop putting yourself in the same box. If you do, the opportunity is probably not going to be there. Look for different goals and all that. So my only concern would be if we try to adhere exactly to those, there might be elements that have negative impact or maybe ignore an aspect of additive manufacturing. But I agree with you. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel, but just be observant and say, okay, what is different? And then let's look at having impact on that. Adrian, any other additional?
I agree. I think one of the biggest, or one of the things we've been fighting is the creation of new rules or being distinct from the other manufacturing technologies. One that comes to mind right off the bat is there was this big uproar about powder safety in additive manufacturing, how it's toxic, it's flammable, it's all this, and they wanted to create new regulations for that. And we stepped in and we said, wait a second, the oil and gas industry and the chemical industry has dealt with this already, and the NFPA in the U.S. has developed all these standards. Why don't we just use those standards that have already been created? And so we don't want to be different. I think we want to leverage as much of what's already been created because I don't think it's necessary for us to create specific regulations or have the government involved to provide oversight in additive manufacturing that is different from what's already been done. I think if anything, what we encourage is regulations and the government to be involved in education to build public awareness, but also awareness within industry about the about the technology and the safety issues associated with it.
A question from the lady over there, please. Just one moment, the mic's coming around.
Could you tell me what your thoughts are on the machinery directive with regard to 3D printers, where it is today and where it may go and the process in the future?
Hello, I'm Dio Kental from Get Ready for 3D. And we're talking about regulation. Of course, regulation will come from legislators, regulation side. But I think demand can also create regulation, demand from the old companies in 3D printing ecosystem. And if we look at the companies that are in the show, most of them are really small. They are startups, and they are managing the resources. Some of them still don't have funding. Some of them will never have. And so when they have to think about getting their product certified, it's really hard. So my question is there any should or could for companies like UL, laboratories like UL, could a special prize for this industry be a way of helping the industry to evolve up to the point where we want that is properly regulated?
Okay, thanks. So two great questions. Adrian, machinery directive, is that one of your areas of expertise? Okay, I think Chris, perhaps you can take the second question first, and then we'll get back to the machinery directive afterwards.
So the second question about helping startups and small companies be compliant with the regulations, absolutely. I mean, I think we can't lower the bar because of based on the size of the company. So everybody has to play according to the same rules and meet the same standards. But we do work with small company startups to provide them with advice and guidance on how to go about doing or what markets to focus on so that they can allocate the resources the best, and also for them to be aware of what are all the compliance issues that they have to address. Many of them are completely unaware of regulatory requirements, and so they start producing their products and they realize that they can't go to market because it's unlawful, and so they fold up. some others have produced products that in the market that have had some incidents, and then they fold up because they have to deal with the liability issues and the lawsuits associated with them. So we do work with them to first provide them with advice so they can do the proper planning for their investors to make sure that they have all the that they're adherent to all the regulatory requirements.
The only other thing I'd add to that is, it is in some jurisdictions there are accounts taken for startups and smaller enterprises. I started work in Australia, and for certain legislations there, so for even just really fundamental ones like privacy, there'd be two types of rules so that your cost of compliance is a lot lower for a small and medium enterprise. And obviously, once you get above a certain threshold, whether it's 250 employees or X% turnover, then the regulations get a little bit stricter because they're expecting a higher level of compliance. But the difficulty with additive manufacturing is that it really depends on what products you're creating, because for certain things where they're consumer facing, it's going to be quite difficult for the legislators to justify having that sort of two-tiered approach and having a more relaxed approach just because you're a small business, because actually the harm that could be created is actually still the same, whether you're a startup or a multinational organization.
We segment the our services to help provide guidance first, so that there could be proper planning for pricing. Also, one thing that I did want to mention that I jogged my memory when Adrian was talking was we also like to participate in incubators or research parks with universities that do promote and support startups. That's at the point where we can provide the guidance and we can share information freely to help those startups understand how to do how to meet the requirements in the most cost-effective way. As far as the pricing, like I said, we really try to help them understand exactly what they need and what they don't need, so that they don't spend a lot of resources trying to figure that out on themselves, because a lot of larger corporations have to do that on their own. They have to figure out what is, they have to have a team of compliance engineers to figure that out, and startups don't have that, so we help them through that. The other question was on the machine directive. That's an excellent question. We face a similar issue in the U.S. a lot with the installation of industrial machines, where they have to meet national and state and even local codes for fire and electrical shock. And in the EU, we do that as well, where it's applicable. The machine directive, we see it as applicable to many of the industrial machines, and we have a team that helps to when a machine is being installed, that it meets those regulations and requirements. So we see it as just like in the U.S., all those codes are applicable for the manufacturing technology. The codes for manufacturing technology are applicable for the industrial machines. We see that the same here in the EU, where the machine directive is very much applicable to that.